Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Today, I wanted to discuss the future of Kingsmarch. Now, this is not a video where I'm talking about Grinding Gear Games' official announcements about what's going to happen. Instead, this is going to be a video based on some informed speculation as to what I think is likely to happen. And of course, it's going to be coming out in a period where most of Grinding Gear Games' focus is on PathOfExile 2. PathOfExile 1 3.26 could still be a long way off. There's no announcement timeline for it as yet. And all I can say is that it's definitely going to be after POE 2's early access starts on the 15th of November, but probably quite a lot after, because Grinding Gear Games aren't going to want to have a minor release, i.e. 3.26, clashing with the biggest thing that they've been putting out, they've been working up to for years and years and years. Anyways, with that in mind, I did want to start with a disclaimer. Nothing in this video is official yet. I have no inside information about what Grinding Gear Games are actually doing. All I can do is speculate based upon some of the things they've typically done in the past, and also based upon some of the consequences that you can work out of some of the decisions that they might make. I have no inside information, and if I did have inside information, I wouldn't be allowed to tell you. One more thing I also wanted to start off this video with is just a quick little apology. This is going to be less edited than usual. The reason for that is I've done some sort of nasty injury to my back recently, and whilst it's massively on the mend, I can't spend a lot of time sitting down at the moment. For that reason, I'm staying within my limits, and that means not spending ages and ages editing the video, re-recording segments where I start waffling too much, and in this video, that waffling will just stay in the video. The first thing I want to point out about the mechanic for 3.25 Kingsmarch is that all of the little pieces of it are really integrated with each other. This is something that's not normally the case with other mechanics. So you think of, say, Legion. Legion has the domain of timeless conflict. This stands alone. Even though it's accessed through the in-map Legion events, it's something that you could separate out from those in-map Legion events, and it would work fine. Or you could consider Delirium as a mechanic. Delirium has a simulacrum. That could just be changed to a unique map if Grinding Gear Games were to decide, you know what, we want to remove Delirium from the game. They probably aren't going to do that with either Delirium or Legion. They've both been fairly popular mechanics, but all of the pieces sort of work independently of each other. That's not the case with Kingsmarch. The whole gold system is extremely tightly designed so that there's a whole lot of really, really important sinks and faucets for gold, and they all work together and make it so that it's quite hard for only one little piece of the puzzle to go core. For instance, one of the things I've seen a lot of people speculating will happen is that gold will go core, Faustus's currency exchange will go core, and nothing else will go core. And I think that that would have huge problems we'll get to in a second. Anyways, let's quickly summarize what gold is. Gold is a league-only mechanic. In standard, just doesn't exist at all, but it drops everywhere, and it's tied to item rarity and monster rarity and a whole bunch of other factors. It's got three major sinks. So you basically have a primary faucet of gold, which is killing monsters in normal play. The more powerful the monsters are, the more gold in theory they drop. In practice, the best way to get them is by killing the monsters that are in tier 17 exclusive packs, whether they be in lower tier maps added either through the use of the invasive adversaries cluster on the Atlas passive tree or through cartography Scarab of the Multitude, or whether they be actually in a tier 17 map. These are the monsters that provide the most gold, and especially packs of magic ones or rare ones, and especially in conjunction with things that add additional mods onto those monsters. Now let's talk the sinks that you've got. Faustus's trades are a major sink of gold, i.e. they remove it from the economy, they remove it from players, and they don't give any back. Kingsmarch's farmers are the biggest single one, and then Kingsmarch mappers are the other substantial gold sink. These are the things that individually can drain a lot of gold from a lot of players at the same time. You have some minor sinks. These are mining, smelting, and disenchanting. And then you have the trivial sinks. These do cost gold, but they're not a very large amount over an entire league. Kingsmarch's setup costs, I've debated putting these into the minor sinks category. They could fit in either. Then you've got Faustus's black market, the way that he offers you well-rolled rares, or at least a chance at well-rolled rares, recombination, and shipping. These are all pretty trivial sinks because the cost of sending off a ship, even if that ship has an enormous amount of loot on it, you know, something that represents millions and millions of gold worth of farming, the cost to send off that ship is pretty trivial. Likewise for recombinators, the cost to recombinate an item is usually measured in the thousands or the tens of thousands if you go by creating a particular end product, maybe 100,000. Basically, you are not going to be spending more gold than you can get in 2 tier 17 maps in order to do an entire recombination project, usually anyway. So what's gold's primary purpose? I think a lot of people have thought about this in various ways. I want you to think instead on large in real life retailers. So if you're an Australian like I am, think of somewhere like Coles. If you're in the United States, think of something like Walmart. Think of the way that they can outcompete small rivals. There's a number of ways they can do that, but one of the key things is that just because of their wealth, they're cheaper and they're more convenient simultaneously than a small retailer is. Now, trade friction is something that can reduce this. Partly there is trade friction for those large IRL retailers. If you think, for instance, in a small town, now we don't have that many of them in Australia, but if you're in the United States, lots of people live in towns with 6,000 people or so. In those places, there's too much friction for somewhere that's a large retailer to set up there, and that means that smaller retailers can thrive, they can fill that niche. Well, with gold does something similar in that it provides various types of trade friction, at least in theory, that are designed to undermine the economic power of the very richest players within PathOfExile. That's the intention. It's to reduce the dominance that super traders can have over the whole trade league economy. Additionally, Faustus's limit of 10 active trades tries to do this. This can be circumvented with alternate accounts. In fact, a lot of things can be in PathOfExile, but basically, these are the core mechanics Grinding Games have used in order to make it so that this does not just become a gift to the biggest flippers in the game. Now, gold works extremely well at this purpose as long as spending gold on Faustus has a meaningful opportunity cost. And that's why it's so important that the gold that we have for Faustus is something that's intimately tied to a whole bunch of other systems in the game. If we have a quick look at shipping, you see that ships turn gold plus time into something that players have unlimited demand for, and that is currency orbs. So with shippers, you're essentially spending a whole bunch of time building up your produce on a farm. You're turning gold into farm produce, and then you're shipping that off to various places, and you're chasing mirror shards. If you don't get mirror shards, you're getting divine orbs. If you don't get divine orbs, you're getting at least something that's useful. Chaos orbs, regal orbs, things like that. On top of that, you're also getting tattoos, you're getting runes, you're getting items, you're getting the odd unique, but these are entirely secondary. The main thing people get out of the ships is those currency orbs, and particularly the mirror shards. So the most critical thing that shipping does is that it provides a scalable way to turn gold that you earn through farming just content in the game, that you turn that into something that you actually want and that you have an unlimited demand for. So what this does is it imposes an opportunity cost to spending gold on Faustus's currency exchange. Gold that you spend on the currency exchange, for instance, if you were to set up a buy order that you were going to try and turn you're trying to set up a buy order for 800 Chaos Orbs against your 2 Awakeners Orbs, let's just assume that's fair at the time that you're talking about this, then that's going to cost you a total of 20,000 gold, because Chaos Orbs cost 25 gold per one that you request. You're requesting 800 of them. So that 20,000 gold then can't in turn be spent on shipping. It's got to be spent on something else instead, and that's the opportunity cost. Anyways, I've run the numbers on gold cost per farm crop, and the 50 million shipment meta we're in at the moment, it's basically a case of you turning 2 million gold that you farmed, plus about 160 hours of real world time, into an average of 2.5 mirror shards. You get more things as well. You get a few divine orbs, you get a few sacred orbs, but the primary thing you're doing there is getting your 2.5 mirror shards on average. Now, this means that there's this demand for gold that is of the order 350,000 per player per day. It's sometimes a bit higher, sometimes a bit lower, but it's something of that sort of ballpark. This requires very little player attention. It's the passive way to turn gold into currency, whereas you can contrast this to 2 more active ways to do it. There is the Atlas Runners, we'll get to in a sec, and there is also Faustus's currency exchange. Faustus's currency exchange has much better returns than this. If you were to flip the Maven chisels that provide increased pack size, and you adjust to do trades with them and divine orbs, you'll find that every time you spend about 8,000 gold, you can make about 4 of these Maven's chisels, which last time I looked, I haven't done this flip for a little while, but last time I looked, that was about 1.6, 1.7 divine orbs. So essentially, you could just keep turning your gold, roughly 5,000 gold into 1 divine orb. It did take some time. It did take some paying attention to things, but it was something that you could do that was a much better return on the gold investment than sending off these big boats. But these big boats let you send off an enormous amount of shipments at once, an enormous amount of value at once, and turn a whole bunch of gold into currency. Why are we talking about the ships though? It's because they impose this opportunity cost that means that the gold that you choose to spend on the currency exchange has a meaningful cost. You are sacrificing something in order to do that. That's the thing that's going on with the Kingsmarch mechanics in 3.25. Everything works together to create this architecture where Faustus is worth using, but at the same time, there is a real cost to using him. Now what I want to do is ask a question. What does trade look like if we keep Faustus in the game, keep gold in the game, but we remove Kingsmarch entirely? So we remove the ships, we remove the Atlas runners, we remove everything else that you can usefully do with your gold, other than using it in order to sit on the auction house and trade things around. So in this scenario, only hardcore traders ever run out of gold. Everyone else has unlimited gold for all of the trades they want to do. This means that gold is essentially worthless. It's no longer loot. And it means that we'll get into a meta where undercutting and counter undercutting becomes the best way to trade. Let's say that the fair price on the market for an Awakener Orb is 470 Chaos Orbs. You're trying to sell one. You list it and you request 470 Chaos from the seller. Now this is going to cost you 11,750 gold in order to set up this order. Now someone else might come along and say, hey, you know what? I also want to sell my Awakener's Orb, but I'm going to list it for 469 Chaos Orbs instead. At this point, the correct thing to do, if you're paying close attention to Faustus, is to retract your 470 Chaos order and then post it again for 468. That's because you're essentially throwing away another 11,500 or so gold in order to set up this new order, but we've ascertained that that's no cost at all. And so just being the first to sell your Awakener's Orb is what you want, and so that's what you're going to do. Ultimately, the best way to play, if you're focused on generating wealth out of the currency exchange, and even if you're not, it becomes to hyper micromanage Faustus. Spend time not killing monsters, stop having fun, and start playing around on Faustus and prioritizing, optimizing all of your orders, reacting to what other players are doing, scouting out what they're doing, and so on. This is not the case at the moment. And the reason it's not the case is that when you want to list that second Awakener Orb sale order, you are throwing away another 11,000 or so gold in order to do so, and that's 11,000 gold that you can't send on a ship. So right now, the best play in 3.25 is just to leave up your now undercut order and just wait until the second buyer comes along. Okay, so is it just the ships? The Atlas runners also turn gold into currency, and they do it more efficiently than the various shipping mechanics do. The thing is that they require a lot more player intervention in order to make them work, a lot more micromanagement, and a lot more messing around with getting replacement mappers and things like that every time one of them has a little bit of an accident and falls to the Hydra in one of their maps. The other thing, though, that I think is a major barrier against Atlas runners returning in the future is that one of their major effects in 3.25 has been turning things that would normally be loot into non-loot, because there's just so many of them in the economy. For instance, Atlas runners produce an ungodly amount of simulacrum splinters, and also an ungodly amount of heist rogue markers. What this has meant is that simulacrum splinters from other sources are just not really loot this league. Heist rogue markers from other sources are just not really loot this league. And so they've turned loot into non-loot. That's been their main effect for various league mechanics. Now, grinding gear games could try and rebalance things here, but I think that this is one of the mechanics that's more likely to go. Ultimately, Atlas mappers have been an interesting little thing to have in the game, but I don't think they've been a smash hit. I don't think that many people love them, even though I've been doing some experimenting on them. And I think they're quite an interesting mechanic. They're quite a bit of a fun, but I don't think that they're worth causing lots of problems in the rest of the game to keep around. I wanted to outline 5 options grinding gear games have for going core, and then some of them I'm going to try and dismiss. The first one, 325 doesn't go core at all, and we return to the 324 trade system. There's no gold, there's no Faustus, nothing from Kingsmarch remains in the game. This is the one I'm going to be the most dismissive of, but I do think it's important to mention that it is an option they can consider. Secondly, 325 goes core, with or without the mappers. Thirdly, of the 325 mechanics, only Faustus's trade goes core. We've sort of already talked about this one a bit. Fourth option, 3.25 goes core with significant changes. And fifth, Faustus goes core, Kingsmarch is removed entirely. Faustus goes core though, as does gold. And then there are some new gold uses that are added to the game in the 3.26 league, which might be league exclusive, or might include standard as well. So let's start with the first option, the potential of nothing going core, of Kingsmarch being burnt to the ground because Sasan the Bandit Lord has managed to achieve complete victory there. I can't imagine Grinding Gear Games choosing this. The reason for this is that Faustus' exchange has been so overwhelmingly positively received that I believe that any attempt to roll it back would result in a player exodus from the game. It would be like Grinding Gear Games deciding, you know what, we're bringing back desync, or you know what, we're going to remove loot filters from the game. I think that until the currency Scarab exchange returns, every league would fail. And Grinding Gear Games know this. They know their customers well enough to know this is the case. Ultimately, Grinding Gear Games, fundamentally they're a business, and they want PathOfExile 1, even while they're focused on PathOfExile 2, they want PathOfExile 1 to continue to bring in money for them. And as a result, they do want the people who aren't interested in PoE 2 at least to continue playing PoE 1. And probably actually I think you'll find that they're going to want people who are PoE 2 primary players, who maybe have played PoE 1 a long time but decide they prefer PoE 2. They don't want them to occasionally come and check out PoE 1 again as well. And with that in mind, I think that they would be shooting themselves in the foot to have nothing of this go core, and I'd be very, very surprised, shocked even, if Faustus doesn't come back. Now, in a different world, it would have been possible for Grinding Gear Games to really stuff up the implementation of the currency exchange. For example, Diablo 3, when it came out, it had two different auction houses. One was a pay-to-cheat auction house, RMT type transactions, but the other one was a legitimate auction house using only in-game resources. And it caused so many problems in the game that it was actually a very popular player demand to entirely remove it, and Diablo ultimately did. Diablo 3 removed both of these auction houses from the game and ultimately did a total rebalance of loot that many people consider to be the best thing that Diablo 3 did. So that's a possible alternate world we could have lived in, one where the entire Faustus mechanic was a disaster. That wasn't the world that we lived in, that didn't happen, and as a result, I think we're definitely not going to see Scenario 1 come true. The closest we might see to Scenario 1 would be if Grinding Gear Games decide they're going to leave Faustus out for one league and then bring him back later, and they want to do some reworks behind the scenes. Even then, I'd be surprised, because I think that would mean 3.26 is just going to fail, and there's no real point putting any work into the rest of 3.26 at that point. Why not just focus on getting it out quicker? If Grinding Gear Games are in a position where they don't think that Faustus is ready to go core, they think there's something really unhealthy about the mechanic, then what I think they need to do is just take a bit of extra time to get 3.26 out and run some sort of PathOfExile 1 event that they can run, like maybe Endless Delve or something like that, in order to basically buy time until they can do that, and then have 3.26 have Faustus in it. Second scenario I wanted to talk about is the idea that Grinding Gear Games release the Kingsmarch content mostly unchanged into the core game. I think this is something that's entirely plausible, except for one little problem, and this is something that could be fixed with a few numbers changes. That is, the whole medals mechanic hasn't really hit very well. The medals were something that were very important early on in limiting player progression speed, but never really mattered much late game. And ultimately, I think that the metals section, both the smelting, the shipping off of refined metal bars, and also the acquisition that's needed in order to build your town, is going to feel a lot worse if this were to go core but not be in every single zone. So if you would only see one metal encounter in every 12.5 zones, as is the case for, say, a breach nowadays, that's not going to be something that's going to feel particularly satisfying. So with that in mind, I think that if Grinding Gear Games decided to have it go core mostly unchanged, they probably don't want to go with the 8% drop rate of metals and come up with some other solution. I'm sure they can do that though. Now, one other problem that's going to come up here is that you're going to have issues there where it's going to put a lot of demands on players for setup time early on. So we have a couple of other mechanics in the game, Delve being the most extreme one, Heist being much less so, where the mechanic just doesn't work very well until you invest a lot of time into it. Now with Heist, that's rolling up rogue follower gear. With Delve, it's delving down to the point that you reach maybe 350 is where it starts feeling a little bit better, and really 500 until it starts feeling like you're actually doing something worthwhile. Now at the moment, at a league start scenario, you've got the Atlas, which is needed for almost every mechanic, and you've also got these other things. You've got Delve, you've got Heist, you've also got Sanctum as well, acquiring the various relics for Sanctum. So there's a number of these mechanics currently in the game. Kingsmarch is at the higher end of these. It's definitely not as onerous as Delve, but I do think that if they were going to add Kingsmarch in mostly unchanged, they're probably going to want to squish down some of this setup cost and make it so that you can get to a well-established Kingsmarch quicker. Ultimately, some of that could just be done by removing the mappers, I think, but that's things that would need to be thought about a bit if grinding gear games decide to go down this route. So the third option I could think of is Faustus is the only thing that goes core. We talked a bit about what this would cause with gold being meaningless, and then you'd have this situation where counter undercutting wars become one of the most rewarding things you can do in the game. And when something that's super rewarding is also not very fun for most players, that's a really bad gameplay loop. That's a problem with game design at that point. So basically, if gold doesn't have another major sink, it's not a cost to spend it. And so we've got all of these issues we talked about before. Now, there could be some modifications made to this 10 orders limit in order to try and find a happy medium. It's my opinion at the moment that the 10 orders limit pushes against the gold becoming completely worthless for the average player. It feels like it's a limit on the average player, but it's not really a limit in a gold is worthless world on the actions of power traders. It's not really going to matter that much for them because they're going to pay more attention to their individual slots, and they're just going to modify them as needed in order to make their orders fill quickly. So it's going to make fire and forget trade interactions worse. It's going to make highly micromanaged ones better. This is not a direction I think the game should go. Now, I don't think that the current 10 order limit is working well because of that. I think it's more punishing of the game the less time that you dedicate to trading. However, I do think there are some solutions, but they would require modifying things in ways that might sometimes feel worse for people. Now, what I think grinding gear games should do, if they do decide Faustus goes core, gold goes core, but not the rest of Kingsmarch, they're going to need to tighten up some of the most powerful things you can do within the 10 order limit. My suggestion that I would have to them then is delaying the clearing up of order slots after an order is cancelled. For instance, you could make it so that once your order fills, you can take your loot out of it straight away, but it's 5 minutes until you can use that order slot again. Or if you want to be really targeted at the people who are hideout warriors, and you want to have less impact on the casual players, which I think is the best goal, what you want to do then is make it so that there's a seismic trap style cooldown system on these, where you can only get one new order per 5 minutes, but maybe you can bank up 6 or 8 of them, so that in most people who aren't really trying to do a whole bunch of flipping, it ends up working really well. It works like it does now. But for people who are flipping, it starts to be a meaningful throttle on them. Again, the reason this is important is that if you don't throttle the power of the people who have got the most wealth in the trade league economy, then they start being able to shove everyone else out of the economy. The fourth scenario that I can see, Kingsmarch goes core, but there are major changes to it. I think one of the most simple changes, and one that I think might not be the worst idea for grinding gear games to consider, will be removing mirror shards from the shipment loot table. Now, this would be a negligible change for casual players, but it would make gold a lot less powerful for power gamer players. And I think it's worth saying that the PathOfExile player base has changed a lot. We have something like 10% of the player base that have the resources to get a Mage Blood every league that they want one now. This was not the case even 5 or 10 leagues ago, but it is the case now. You can see there's always tens of thousands of people with Mage Blood equipped on POE.ninja, and of the people who don't have it equipped, there's lots of people that have got more expensive items equipped, like OSIN, or they've just decided to go with a different belt. So basically doing this would be a significant nerf to Kingsmarch for that top 10% or so of the player base, but it would be negligible change for everyone else. I think in this case though, Kingsmarch would still be an effective gold sink. It would still be something that people want to send off larger shipments in. Maybe you'd end up settling for something smaller than 50 million, which means that you get your big shipments in more often than you do now. And also it would be something worth spending gold on as an alternative to feeding it into Faustus and currency trades. The fifth scenario I can think of is that grinding gear games add new gold sinks and Faustus goes core minus Kingsmarch. I think this is something that's a lot of work, but it's also doable. It does, however, have one very real problem though, and that is that grinding gear games know that the gold sinks they made in 3.25 work. They know they have appeal both to casual players and to power gamers. At least when I talk about casual players, I'm talking casual endgamers. So we're talking people who are doing tier 16 maps, but not necessarily doing hyper-optimized strategies and the like. At the same time, the appeal of gold sinks to power gamers is even clearer. So Kingsmarch manages to achieve this, but a new system might not. It might end up having some balance issues that mean it misses the mark a little bit. So that would require an enormous amount of thought, an enormous amount of care. Maybe it's safer to keep Kingsmarch around. Now, I do think one thing needs to be said though, and that is, I know Standard's not the most popular way to play Path of Exile, but it is absolutely perfect for some of the player base. If we have a scenario where gold sinks don't exist in Standard, then we're going to have a real problem if Faustus goes core, where Standard's just going to feel more dominated even than it already is by the wealthiest players. So that's something Grinding Games should consider. I honestly think they should market Standard more than they do. It's the best place for people to play if those players get 40 hours or less per league cycle. And that's a fair number of people in gaming these days. It's not like everyone gets multiple hours per week every week in order to play. If you're the sort of person who loves Path of Exile, but you just can't get your Atlas finished during an individual league, then Standard's probably the right place to play. And a mechanic that's not available in Standard is something that's a lot worse. And so yeah, I hope Grinding Games can do something there that makes Faustus mechanics work well in Standard as well. The last thing I wanted to finish with though is some talk about Rog. Rog is an example of something where players got something very, very wrong early in patch 3.25. Recombinators were thought to be a shell of their former selves, which to some extent is true, but were also thought to be completely useless as well. Then eventually players solved about 3 weeks into the league how they worked, and their power started being recognized. Now, Grinding Games might consider Recombinators to be too strong to go core, because they might consider that they render other forms of crafting mostly irrelevant and disincentivize a bunch of content that's tied to those crafting methods. For instance, this league, virtually no one is using dense fossils or prismatic fossils or pristine fossils, all of which have been somewhat of a pull to delve at various points in the game's history. It's not that no one's using them at all, it's just that they're not being used nearly as much as they used to be. And that's something that then pushes away from delve. So that's one of the things that Rog is doing, and something that they may wish to correct for by removing him. Or alternately though, there's some content that's run more because Recombinators exist, like Breach and Grasping Males. Now, I do think that if Recombinators remain at their current power, we are going to see the Trickster Ascendancy nerfed next league. I can't imagine Grinding Games leaving Escape Artist untouched for another league where Recombinators on day 3 or 4, if maybe even day 2, players that know what they're doing with Recombinators can mass produce huge evasion energy shield chests and can do this really early on. You can make a 3200 evasion, 660 energy shield, necrotic armor really, really, really cheap with Rog, as long as you're willing to do a whole bunch of messing around in order to do that. That's not going to get the suffixes right on the item. That's going to be a big expense. But it means that anyone that's playing a Trickster can count upon having that chest really early in the league, and that's going to mean a lot of people won't bother rolling another Ascendancy. That's why I think that if Grinding Games don't nerf Rog, they're probably going to nerf the Trickster. We shall see on that front though. One thing I think Grinding Games should seriously consider though, is making Rog a massive gold sink. The moment he's a pretty trivial gold sink, and you get all the power of Recombinators, but you don't need a lot of gold in order to power it. You probably need to spend maybe 50,000 gold per item that you end up crafting. That's not a very large amount for the sort of power level of the items that you can make with him. Now, if GGG were to change this and make Rog replace farmers as the primary sink for gold, I think that could be a really interesting outcome, but it's something they'd need to get right, and it's something that could be really messy if they get the numbers wrong on it. Doing this would require huge increases, like we're talking multiplying by a factor of 60 or 100, the amount of gold that it costs to recombinate items, and or the amount of gold it costs to disenchant items, and various other things related to doing so. So it could work, but it would require very careful balancing. Anyways, I feel that's the pros and the cons of various options Grinding Games have for keeping 3.25 core. I think the worst decision they could make is removing Faustus and removing the gold mechanics. The best decision they could make is bringing back 3.25's Kingsmarch mechanics mostly untouched, but with a couple of things potentially removed. Potentially removing the Atlas runners, potentially changing around some of the numbers on other things, maybe nerfing the chances of mirror shards or removing them entirely. but making it so that people still want to engage with Kingsmarch, but it doesn't feel like it's a massive pressure. It doesn't feel like it's the best thing you can do. It feels like it's a worthwhile way to spend all your surplus gold. Then, at the same time, for people who want to do lots of trading that's for the purposes of just doing buying and selling, just arbitrage trading, they can do that, but they won't be in a position where they can just shove everyone else out of the market. People who want to just trade for items for their own personal use, they'll be able to do so without having to face too much opposition from the people who are power traders. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results, and may the rest of your 3.25 be gold.